I want to say first just how honored I am and how pleased I am to have been invited to speak on this very important occasion, the 50th anniversary of the beginning of ping pong diplomacy. I'm also very sorry that circumstances prevent me or make it impossible for me to be there with you in person. I know that would have been wonderful. It would have been wonderful to see old friends. It would have been wonderful to celebrate such a major event in the history of the relationship of our two peoples. And it would have been wonderful to do it in Shanghai, because if you promise not to tell anyone else, I have to admit that Shanghai is my favorite city in China. So I'm really, really sorry that I can't be there with all of you today, because I'm sure that this whole event is going to be a fascinating one, and one that people will learn from and people will remember quite happily. While ping pong diplomacy changed the course of Sino-American relations, it also changed the course of my life. And I was leaving Hong Kong in late May, early June of '71, because I had finished my 2-year tour of duty at the consulate in Hong Kong. So I returned home to Michigan, where my family lived. And then I was about 2 days away from leaving to go down to Washington to take my next position, which was going to be in Surabaya, Indonesia, when I got a telephone call from 2 former professors who asked me if I would consider taking a year's leave of absence from the Foreign Service and go to New York and work for this organization, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, because it was going to be hosting the visit, or co-hosting along with the U.S. Table Tennis Association, the visit of the Chinese ping pong team sometime in 1972. I wasn't really sure I wanted to do that, or know the history of U.S.-China relations may remember that it was in July of 1971 that President Nixon came on television and announced that Dr. Kissinger had made his secret trip to Beijing. So that having happened, my interest in going to New York became somewhat stronger. And in fact, all of my colleagues in Washington at the Foreign Service said to me, well, you'd be crazy not to go up there and do it. It's a really exciting time. Things between the two countries may develop very quickly. I suppose the thing that stands out most, and what always struck me, both at the time, although not quite when I was living it, but shortly thereafter, was how easy it was to sort of move from a period when people in two countries who had been conditioned by their governments and their media to think of the other as enemies, how quickly they were able to overcome that and change the sort of negative stereotypes that our two peoples had of one another. The main theme was friendship. It was just pervasive. And if I had to come up with one phrase that would sort of describe that period, it would be Yo-E-D-E beside the R. Everybody learned that phrase, Yo-E-D-E beside the R. So everybody, whether it was journalists or the other players or ordinary Americans that the delegation would meet, they would always usually come up with a question to one of the Chinese: what has impressed you most about your trip to the United States? And invariably, the Chinese would answer, whether it was an official or whether it was a ping pong player or whether it was a journalist, their answer would be, what's impressed us most is the warmth and the friendship and the kindness that's been shown to us by the American people. Now, the first few times I heard that response, I thought to myself, they really don't think that's what they were told to say, because it sounds good and it's very diplomatic. But as I traveled around the United States with the team, I found that that's the answer that I would have given too, because I was really enormously impressed by how open the American people were and how generous and how warm and hospitable they were. In sort of preparation for this, to remind myself of it, I took a look at the half-hour documentary that the Chinese documentary film company made on the visit. And another reason why that always sticks in my memory is that the final scenes of that documentary are all of us who traveled during the whole time. So standing there waving goodbye to the Chinese who were by that point on the plane. And some of us were crying because we were really sad that we'd been with the group for 4 weeks. We'd gotten to know people well. And so I get very emotional. And so I was crying. And when my first couple of trips to China, but especially my first trip to China, which was just about a year after the ping pong visit, it was in June of '73, I would meet people and they would look at me and they'd say, "Oh, it won't be any surprise to you that that I believe firmly in engagement. I think it is absolutely essential that people, whether they agree with one another or not, that they continue to engage with each other and sit down and talk with one another. I think this argument that engagement has been wasted, the past 40, 50 years of engagement have been for nothing, is absurd and ridiculous. The goal was never to transform China into a liberal democracy. The people who were involved in crafting that policy were not naive, and they knew China well. Objectives, I think, were threefold. One was to enhance American security by deterring the Soviet Union. I think another was to deliberately, and I would add very effectively, facilitate China's rise, both for its citizens, but also selfishly in order to make China a stronger partner with the United States against the Soviet Union. And third, I think, was to ensure that China become a more prosperous country so that eventually it would become enmeshed in a rules-based order. So those were our three reasons for doing it, and the detractors of the policy are not giving that any credibility. And I think they also weren't paying attention to the organic growth of the relationship. And then finally, these detractors, they don't talk about what the alternatives would be. You know, if we hadn't had this engagement, it could have been a whole lot worse than it is now. So I think that engagement, despite what the detractors say, it benefited the American people a lot. It strengthened our deterrence capability and therefore helped reduce the danger of a nuclear threat and a Soviet attack on the United States and its allies. It's clear that there have been no major conflicts in the East Asian region in the past 5 decades. And that's in great contrast to the years before that, when the US was involved very heavily in military operations, whether it was World War II or the Korean War, Vietnam War, but that it's been peaceful for the last 5 decades. And I attribute that a lot to the relationship and engagement between China and the United States. And I also think that that avoidance of war or of conflict in East Asia is what has enabled the region to become the fastest growing and most dynamic region in the world. I think that today that we have to continue people-to-people relationships because they are very important. And sometimes I believe that our two governments, in fact, don't necessarily do the right things, but I trust more in the people of the two countries to do the right things rather than the two governments. I really firmly believe in people-to-people engagement, and I think that in order to do this, in order to make people-to-people engagement successful, we really have to go back to the early 70s. In the 70s, both governments actually stepped back and allowed the people to take the relationship at their own pace. Both governments At least the US government sort of paved the way by relaxing or removing certain restrictions that we had had that prevented interaction between the two countries. And Beijing gradually did the same. And this enabled the primary drivers of the relationship to be the private sector. And it was the American people and the Chinese people who were acting without, they had government permission to do it, but it was the bankers and the artists and the ping pong players and everybody who was involved in the myriad numbers of exchanges that began in the 70s and grew to such great lengths that we just have enormous, deep web of relationships between Chinese and American people that is very hard to rip apart. And so the society to society dimensions of the relationship grew very quickly, and in some ways became more significant than the government to government relationship that had made this all possible. So I think that decision to allow extensive engagement by individuals and private entities was part, at least on the American side, it was part of a broader strategy to add resilience to this new relationship and to forge a lot of ties, both at the official level, but also at the unofficial level. I think the logic on the American side was simple, but very important. It was that the greater number of people and the more people that were involved and the broader the scope of the relationship and interests, the larger array of constituencies you would have who would want to keep a stake in the relationship and make it successful. Unfortunately, we have allowed on both sides, we've allowed that relationship to deteriorate. And there are, as we all know now, very great problems that we're all facing. And I think we all have to work that much harder and that much more consistency with each other to make sure that we don't let the people who are opposed to the relationship gain the upper hand. I think the two governments, if they want to engage in tit-for-tat actions such as tariffs or sanctions, that's their prerogative to do so. Personally, I don't think that such actions are useful at all. In fact, I think for the most part, what the two governments do and say to each other are counterproductive. But I just want them to let the citizens alone so that they can carry on whatever people-to-people relations that they wish. And over the past 40 years, they've done a really great job at building this strong web that I mentioned before. In the meantime, what I think is really important is to make sure that all of us who are involved in the relationship, there's a lot of talk about pengyo and being friends. And I think it's important to be a pengyo, but I think it's more important to be a zhengyo, a friend who is willing to tell their friends on the other side what they really believe and to speak the truth and to make sure that we are all as open and as honest with each other as we can be, because if we aren't, that is going to only add to the further decline in that wonderful relationship that we had during the high period of engagement.